After a war hero's Mustang is stolen and desecrated by a violent biker gang intent on destroying American symbols, a grieving family in rural Wyoming chooses to stand their ground. Led by a widowed mother, her retired Marine father, and a growing alliance of veterans and locals, the community fights back, not just with strength, but with purpose. As their stand inspires others across the country, what begins as a rescue mission becomes something much greater, a movement to restore honor, unity, and hope in a time of growing darkness. But as their message spreads, a deeper enemy emerges, organized, calculating, and determined to silence them. With everything on the line, the people of Willow's Creek must decide how far they're willing to go to defend what they love. And somewhere in the middle of it all, one horse reminds them what it means to endure. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. Every town has a line that must never be crossed. Tonight, the iron vultures won't just cross it, they'll burn it down. In the stillness of the early morning, when the frost clung to the tips of the wild prairie grass and the skies above Wyoming stretched endlessly blue, the Kingston family ranch stirred with the quiet rhythms of survival. This was the kind of land where men were born to work and women were forged to endure. A place where time moved slower, but the memories never did. At the heart of the property was Rachel Kingston, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering resilience. She'd buried her husband to cancer, her brother to war, and her youth to the weight of responsibility. Now, in her early 40s, she ran the ranch with a weathered dignity that made people speak her name with equal parts respect and sorrow. She wasn't alone. Her children, Emily, 17, bold and fiery, and Jake, only 10, wide-eyed and too gentle for the world, brought both purpose and pain. And then there was George, her father, a retired Marine who rarely smiled, but always stood tall. His silence was not absence, it was armor. He had buried too many comrades to believe in the permanence of peace, but the soul of the ranch wasn't a person. It was a horse, a wild, scarred Mustang named Thunder, brought home by Rachel's brother Aaron during his last leave before deploying to Afghanistan. He'd found the horse tangled in barbed wire at the edge of Bureau land, half dead and ready to give up. Aaron had named him Thunder for the sound of his hooves when he ran, raw, defiant, alive. When Aaron didn't come home, Thunder became more than a memory. He became part of the family's grief, a living piece of their lost son, uncle, and brother. He was the heart of the ranch, the last living tether to a man who died serving something greater than himself, and now someone was about to take him. The trouble didn't arrive with a siren. It came with an engine growl. At first, no one paid attention to the bikers when they rolled into town 2 weeks earlier. The iron vultures, strangers on heavy motorcycles, their jackets stitched with skulls, flags, and smoke. They loitered in front of the diner, drank hard at the roadhouse, and laughed louder than they needed to. But laughter isn't a crime, and in small towns, people give too much time to strangers, until it's too late. Their leader, Briggs, was the type of man whose silence was louder than his words. Tall, gaunt, with arms lined in prison ink, he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. The men around him were loyal or afraid, usually both. Briggs had the air of someone who had long ago stopped believing in rules, except his own. No one in town wanted to say it out loud, but they all knew. These men weren't just passing through. They were hunting for something. It was the flag that started it. At the Saturday farmers' market, George Kingston wore his old Marine jacket. Not for show, but because it still fit and kept the wind off his bones. On the shoulder, weathered but proud, was the American flag patch, stitched on by Aaron himself the day before shipping out. Briggs passed by and spat near George's boots. Nice. Patch, he muttered. Shame what it stands for now. George turned slowly. His eyes, grey as steel, met Briggs with no fear. It still stands, he said. Just fine without your opinion. Briggs smirked. Careful, old man. Around here, flags get torn down faster than fences. George didn't blink, only by cowards. The air went cold. Eyes turned. Tension crackled. Briggs walked away without another word, but everyone watching knew what had just happened. A line had been drawn. That night, it was crossed. Rachel had just come in from the barn when she heard the barking. Thunder's bark, short and panicked, not the playful kind. She rushed to the window. A dozen motorcycles. Headlights off, shadows moving like ghosts. Her heart dropped. Dad, she called. Jake, Emily, stay inside. George was already outside, shotgun in hand, but he was 72, and there were too many of them. The barn doors were kicked in. Thunder screamed, a deep, wounded cry. He reared up, panicked, wild. Two bikers tried to lasso him, but Thunder wasn't going quietly. George fired once into the air. Back off, he shouted. A chain cracked across the back of his legs. He went down. They didn't stop. They didn't even hesitate. One of them shoved Rachel aside as she ran out, grabbing for Thunder's bridle. She hit the ground hard. Breath knocked from her lungs. Thunder was dragged out under moonlight, muscles straining against rope and fear. The bike engines revved like devils, and with a final roar, they tore off into the darkness. When the dust cleared, George lay bleeding in. The dirt. The barn was trashed, and Thunder, the only piece of Aaron they still had, was gone. Jake sobbed in the doorway, clutching the flag from his uncle's funeral. Rachel stood in the silence, and something inside her broke. The sheriff came the next morning, said it was probably a misunderstanding, said they'd look into it, but Rachel had seen the fear in his eyes. He knew who the Iron Vultures were. He wasn't going to do anything. She walked him out without a word, closed the door, locked it behind him. Then she poured coffee, sat at the table, and stared at the empty stall through the kitchen window. He was all we had left of him, George whispered from his chair, voice hoarse from pain. Rachel nodded. Her voice was quiet, but unshaking. Then they're going to give him back. George looked at her. How? Rachel stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled down a wooden box, dusty, worn, and kept closed since Aaron's death. She opened it. Inside, a folded map, dog tags, an old service pistol, and a photo of Aaron smiling beside Thunder, Rachel's. Hands trembled, but her eyes blazed with purpose. We start by finding out where they're going. She looked to the window again, where the fence was still broken, where hoofprints ended at the road. And then we bring him home. The sun rose over the plains of Willow's Creek like it always did. Quiet, indifferent, and golden. But something had shifted in the air. It wasn't just the broken barn door or the muddy tire marks cutting across the Kingston pasture. It was the silence at breakfast, the way George stirred his coffee without drinking it, the way Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she tied Jake's shoelaces, and the way Emily stood by the window, eyes locked on the fence where Thunder used to run. There was an emptiness now, a piece of the ranch missing. Not just a horse, but the soul that had kept Aaron alive in their memories. Rachel hadn't slept. She'd spent the night going through every contact in Aaron's old army journal, every slip of paper he'd tucked away in that wooden box, searching for anything useful, a friend, a code, a number. But all she found were names she didn't, no cities far away, and notes scribbled in his sharp, neat handwriting. She felt stupid, thinking there would be some clue waiting to jump out and lead her to Thunder. This wasn't a movie. This was real. And whoever had taken Thunder hadn't done it for money or for ransom. They did it to make a statement. By mid-morning, Rachel stood outside the sheriff's office. The building was small and unimpressive. 2 desks, a coffee maker, and an old American flag bleached by sun through the window. Sheriff Burns was inside, sitting behind his desk with a radio in his hand and a face full of excuses. He looked up when Rachel walked in and sighed like he'd been expecting her. "We're doing what we can," he said, before she even opened her mouth. Rachel didn't sit. "You know who did this?" Burns hesitated. "Look, Rachel, you and your family mean a lot to this town, but these boys, the Iron Vultures, they're not like the punks we usually deal with. They're organized, they're armed, and they're not afraid of jail because they've been there." She stepped closer. "Then maybe it's time they met someone who isn't afraid of them." Burns lowered his voice. "You want me to start a war with a biker gang over a stolen horse?" "It's not a horse," she snapped. "It's what he meant. It's what they took from my kids, from my father. It's what they stomped on when they dragged Thunder away in the middle of the night." Burns looked away. "I have a town to protect." Rachel's jaw clenched. "Then protect it." Outside, she climbed back into her truck and gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make her knuckles pale. She didn't cry. There was no time for that. She drove home in silence, her mind spinning through options that didn't exist. That afternoon, George sat sharpening his old car knife on the porch, the way he used to before deployments. Emily came out and watched him for a while without speaking. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Same thing I did back then." Emily frowned. "Which is?" "Wait for them to make another mistake." That mistake came sooner than anyone expected. The next day, the family went into town for supplies. Rachel needed to restock after the damage to the barn, and Jake needed school shoes. Emily insisted on coming, mostly to stay close. George tagged, along out of stubborn pride, limping from the injury but refusing to be left behind. The town square felt smaller than usual. Conversations hushed when the Kingstons walked by. Nobody said anything, but Rachel could feel it. The pity, the fear, the guilt of neighbors who had seen the Iron Vultures cruise in and had done nothing. At the farmer's market, they stopped near a produce stand. Jake was picking apples when the sound of revving engines cut through the air like a blade. People looked up. Some froze. Others quietly stepped back. It was them. The Iron Vultures. 12 bikes rolled down Main Street, their engines low and heavy, like a warning drum. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the market where Rachel and her family stood. Briggs dismounted first, chewing a toothpick, sunglasses hiding his eyes. He looked around casually before locking his gaze on George. "Well, if it ain't the flagman," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. George didn't move. He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and gently guided him behind Rachel. Briggs strolled forward, boots crunching over gravel. "Heard you're still limping. You should have known better than to pull a weapon on a guest." "You weren't a guest," George said flatly. "You were a trespasser." Briggs smiled, but it was the kind that made your skin crawl. Funny thing about property lines, sometimes they move. Rachel stepped forward, shielding Jake and Emily behind her. "You've made your point. Now get back on your bike and go." Briggs looked at her, amused. "You must be the sister." She didn't blink. "And you must be the coward." The crowd gasped. Briggs' smile faded. For a moment, the air felt like it might tear apart. One of the other bikers stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. Another reached into his vest. George shifted slightly, placing himself between the biker and his grandchildren. Briggs held up a hand. "Easy, boys. We don't want to scare the nice folks." He turned to Rachel. "But just so we're clear, lady, this ain't over. That horse, he was just the beginning." He turned and spat on the ground near George's boots. Then he walked back to his bike. Before leaving, Briggs made sure to pass the Kingston truck parked at the curb. He pulled something from his vest and scratched a deep X across the driver's side door with a knife. Then he looked back at Rachel and tapped the blade against his temple, a warning, a mark. They were now officially a target. When the gang finally left, silence returned to the square. But the damage had been done. The townspeople avoided eye contact. Some even walked away. Rachel watched them go with a hollow feeling in her chest. Cowards. That night the barn smelled like smoke again. Rachel couldn't sleep. She wandered out to the pasture with a flashlight and stared at the open gate. George joined her while carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of them spoke at first. He handed her a mug. "They're not going to stop," She nodded. I know. George looked up at the stars. The sheriff's not going to help. The town's too scared, and we're alone. Rachel took a sip of the bitter coffee. Then we fight alone. You ready for that? She turned and looked him straight in the eye. I've already lost everything I was afraid to lose. George nodded. Then he did something he hadn't done since Aaron's funeral. He placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed it. There would be no cavalry. No help from outside. Just them, standing between what they loved and what was coming. But sometimes that's all it takes. Just one family, standing tall, against the storm. There were moments, Rachel had come to believe, when time no longer moved forward, it simply held its breath. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls and left your thoughts echoing too loud. Emily had gone silent again. Jake, who used to hum while brushing his teeth, barely made a sound. George read the same newspaper 3 times and didn't absorb a word. Rachel cleaned the same countertop for 15 minutes, trying to scrape away something that wasn't really there. Since the confrontation at the market, the town had grown colder. Rachel saw it in the eyes of the people she had known for years. Store owners, neighbors, even the postman. They didn't look at her the same, not out of judgment, but fear. She had become a reminder of what no one wanted to admit, that something darker had taken root in Willow's Creek, and it was growing bolder by the day. That afternoon, Rachel drove out to the edge of their property, where the last row of fencing stood broken. Thunder's tracks, now a week old, had faded under dust and time. Still, she knelt beside them, running her hand through the dirt, like it might offer up some forgotten truth. But there was nothing. No direction, no clue, just an empty trail leading into a world that didn't care. When she got back to the house, George was sitting on the porch with a pair of binoculars and a radio scanner in his lap. The old war vet looked tired, not in his body but in his soul. The weight of helplessness sat on him like armor, and Rachel hated it. They've been circling, he said without looking up. Same bikes, different hours like clockwork. They want us afraid, George snorted. Then they're wasting their gas. Rachel sat down beside him, staring at the horizon. I can't live like this, Dad. No one's asking you. 2. They're not going to stop with Thunder. I know. She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a worn envelope, its edges soft with age. Inside was a letter, Aaron's last one, the one he wrote before his final deployment. It wasn't long, but it had weight. The kind of weight you don't forget. She read it aloud. If anything happens to me, don't let it harden you. The world's already too full of people who stopped believing things could get better. Keep the horse. He saved me out here. Maybe he'll save something back home too. Her voice cracked on that last line, but she didn't stop. She folded the letter and put it back in her coat. We can't let them win, Dad. We just can't. George nodded slowly. Then we don't. That night, Rachel stayed up late after the kids had gone to bed. She sat at the kitchen table with a road map of the surrounding states, a cup of black coffee, and every contact number Aaron had scribbled down in his journals. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that she had to do something. Most of the numbers were dead ends, disconnected, changed or met with silence, until she tried the one listed only as Walter, Idaho, stopover. She nearly hung up when a tired voice answered. Yeah? She froze for a moment. Is this Walter? Depends who's asking. My name's Rachel Kingston. My brother was Aaron Kingston. He served with... I know who Aaron was. There was a long pause. I owe him. Rachel blinked, caught off guard. You do? He pulled me out of a fire base when I didn't think I was coming home. I've owed him. Since? Never got the chance to say anything. He's gone, I figured. Rachel swallowed hard. But his horse isn't. Thunder. A gang took him. They're using him as leverage. I think they're trying to break us. What do you want from me? I want to find him, and I don't have anyone left to call. Another long silence. Then, "You got a picture of the horse?" Rachel pulled a photo from the drawer, a Polaroid of Thunder standing near the barn, Aaron's arm slung over the Mustang's back. "I can send it. Do it. I got a lot of contacts on the road. Some still owe me. I'll ask around." Rachel didn't know whether to feel relief or skepticism. "Why would you help us?" "Because someone once told me you don't let good people fight alone." She wrote down his number, thanked him, and ended the call. For the first time in days, she exhaled. George came in from the porch. What was that? A thread. Maybe something to pull. 3 days later, the phone rang just past midnight. Rachel jumped up from the couch, her heart pounding. On the other end, Walter's voice was gravelly but alert. "I think we found him." Rachel nearly dropped the phone. "Thunder? There's a gas station outside Billings, Montana. Rural. Quiet. One of my guys said there's a Mustang tied up behind it. Matches the description. Scar on the flank, limp on the left. No tags, no owner. Is he okay?" "Not sure. Looks shaken. Skinny, but alive." Rachel covered her mouth. "Oh my God, I'm not there. But I got a friend who is. He's a good man. Name's Ben Carver. Homeless, mostly, but he's sharp. He saw the bike gang leave him there, said they just dumped him like garbage. Why would they leave him? No idea. Maybe the horse fought back, or maybe they figured the message was already sent." Rachel was already packing her bag, boots thudding across the floor. "Can you keep an eye on him, please?" "Ben won't let anything happen to him. You have my word. Thank you." Before she could hang up, Walter added, "You be careful. If they know you're looking, they might be watching." Rachel paused, the weight of his warning settling deep. "I'm not afraid of them. You should be." She hung up, walked into the hallway, and knocked gently on George's door. He opened it in seconds, as if he hadn't been sleeping. "We found him." George stared at her, processing. Then he turned and started pulling on his boots. "I'll get the truck." Rachel smiled, tears threatening to fall. For the first time in a long time, they had something the Iron Vultures didn't expect: hope. The road to Montana was a stretch of silence, broken only by the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional rumble of an 18-wheeler passing by in the opposite lane. Rachel drove through the night, her eyes locked on the highway, hands steady on the wheel. George sat beside her, rifle case at his feet, one hand resting on his knee, the other drumming. A slow rhythm against the window. Neither spoke much. There was nothing left to say. They'd made their choice. What lay ahead would either bring Thunder home or bury another part of their family. The closer they got to Billings, the more the world seemed to shrink. Gas stations stood like relics of a forgotten America, dusty, half-lit with flickering signs and silent pumps. Rachel followed the directions Walter had given, each mile dragging the weight of 1,000 what-ifs. What if Thunder was gone? What if it was a trap? What if the Iron Vultures were waiting? At dawn, the sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale glow across a rusted sign that read, "Bill's Gas and Oil, next left." Rachel slowed and turned off the highway, her pulse quickening. The station looked like it had been abandoned a decade ago. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. A single pickup sat parked near the side, its windows fogged from the inside. The air smelled like old oil and dust. She cut the engine. George was the first to speak. "Stay in the truck." Rachel ignored him and stepped out, her boots crunching. The gravel. She scanned the lot. No signs of movement, just the pickup and the long, low building with boarded windows and peeling paint. Then she heard it. A soft, shuddering snort. She turned toward the back of the station. There he was. Thunder stood near the dumpsters, tied to a bent metal post with a frayed rope. His black coat was matted and streaked with dirt, ribs showing through. His flank, but his eyes were still alive, wild, alert, full of fight. He stamped his hoof once and jerked his head, testing the rope. When he saw her, he froze. Rachel felt the tears rise, hot and fast. "Hey, boy," she whispered, stepping closer. "I'm here." Thunder snorted again, unsure. Then a voice cut through the still air. "He's been like that since they left him." Rachel spun, heart pounding. A man stepped out from behind the dumpsters, older, with a grey beard, rough jacket, and eyes like he'd seen too much and stopped caring a long time ago. He raised both hands. "Name's Ben. Walter sent me." George appeared beside Rachel, rifle in hand, but lowered. Ben nodded at the weapon. "Don't blame you." Rachel turned, back to Thunder, her voice thick with emotion. "They just left him here." Ben nodded. "Dumped him like trash, tied him up and rode off. I've been feeding him what I could get. He's tough. Damn thing kicked one of their guys in the chest. I think. Might be why they gave up." George stepped forward and checked the rope, then gently touched Thunder's side. The horse flinched, then settled. Rachel looked at Ben. "Why'd you help?" Ben shrugged. "Because someone should." She studied him. Dirty boots, calloused. Hands, a scar under his left eye that looked like it had a story behind it. "You a veteran?" "Yeah. A long time ago." She nodded, and for a moment they shared an understanding. Not words, just the weight of things they'd both carried. With effort, George untied Thunder, who staggered but held. Rachel led him slowly toward the truck. They'd brought a trailer, and it took time to coax him inside, but once the door was latched and the locks checked, she let herself breathe. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Because the second she turned around, she saw the note. It had been nailed to the side of the gas station, folded and stabbed with a hunting knife. Rachel pulled it free, her hands shaking. It was a photo of her children. Jake playing in the yard. Emily walking. Home from school, and on the back, written in thick black marker, "We're not done." Her vision went white with rage. She showed it to George, who said nothing, but his jaw clenched hard enough to crack stone. Ben looked between them. "You're in deep with something, aren't you?" Rachel nodded. "They took our horse to send a message. Now they're sending another." Ben exhaled. "You need help." Rachel looked at him. "You offering?" "Not much I can offer, but I got people. Other guys like me. Ones the world forgot." George raised an eyebrow. "Why would they help? Because they've been waiting for a reason." Rachel hesitated. "What would it take?" Ben pulled a beat-up phone from his pocket and started typing. "Just a call." By the time they got Thunder settled in a makeshift stall behind a vet's barn just outside town, Rachel had a list of names. Ben had made a few calls, quiet, coded, the kind of conversations people don't admit to having. One name came up again and again: Lena Park, tech head, recon, work, knows how to track movement. Mason Briggs, tracker, not related to the gang leader, just cursed with the same last name. He knew land better than anyone alive. Rachel stared at the list. None of these people were police. None of them were ordinary, but maybe that was the point. She glanced at George. "We need eyes, ears. We need to know what they're doing, where they're going, and how many there are." George tapped the photo in her hand. "And we need to know how they got that close." By nightfall, Lena had already joined them via satellite call. Her voice was brisk, no nonsense, just facts. "They're running cell towers out of Boise. I can triangulate some of the traffic, but I'll need burner phones and time." Rachel agreed. "What do you need from us?" "Everything. Any photos. License plates, facial descriptions. I'll build a movement pattern." Briggs was harder to reach, but when he answered, his voice was deep and tired. "I work alone." Rachel explained, told him about Thunder, about the note. There was silence. Then, "Where?" She gave him the coordinates. He didn't ask why, didn't ask who she was. Just said, "I'll be there in 2 days." Rachel hung up, staring at the phone. George leaned against the trailer. "You trust them?" "No, but you're calling them anyway. They're not heroes, Dad." "No," George said quietly, "but they might be what we need, somewhere outside the limits of what law could reach." Rachel Kingston had started something she couldn't stop. A ripple through a quiet town, a quiet family, and a quiet war that had just been declared. She looked back at Thunder, now sleeping, the scar on his side rising and falling with each breath. It wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about the people who thought they could tear down everything her family stood for, and it was time they learned what it meant to come for the wrong kind of quiet. The small town of Helena, Montana, woke slowly each morning, like a bear reluctant to stir from hibernation. It wasn't a place of urgency, and that was what Ben Carver had liked about it when he'd first wandered in 6 years ago, carrying only a duffel bag and the weight of too many unspoken memories. He slept near the train yard, made a living doing odd jobs, and kept mostly to himself. The townspeople had grown used to his presence, not friendly, but not unfriendly either. He was a part of the scenery now, unthreatening, invisible, until the day he found Thunder. It had been just after sunrise when he spotted the truck with out-of-state plates speeding off down the gravel road beside Bill's Gas and Oil. Something about the way it peeled away, the dust it kicked up, the tension. In the air, it felt wrong. He went to check and found the Mustang tied up, panting, wild-eyed and foaming at the mouth. Ben knew the look, panic, exhaustion. It was the same expression he'd seen in the mirror 1,000 times during the nights when sleep didn't come. He hadn't meant to get involved. But Thunder wouldn't stop looking at him, so he stayed. Now, as Rachel and George headed back toward Wyoming, with Thunder safe in their trailer, Ben stood in the back lot of the gas station, watching the same stretch of gravel, waiting for a return that hadn't come yet. He wasn't much for prayers anymore, but something about the moment made him murmur one anyway. The town had already started to whisper. A few folks had seen the horse. A few more had heard the name Iron Vultures tossed around. Rumors, at first small, manageable, but rumors in towns like these spread like fire in dry brush. And that fire had already started burning. Ben didn't notice the 3 men until they were almost on him. They came in from the alley, 2 tall and wiry, the third short and thick-set, all leather jackets and silent steps. They didn't introduce themselves, but they didn't need to. The look in their eyes said everything. They wanted the horse back. Or at least they wanted to punish whoever had taken him from their grasp. "You're the one that called in the vet for the horse," the short one said, not really asking. Ben didn't move. "I was. Should have minded your business." Ben's hand slipped into his coat pocket and found the folding knife. Not much of a weapon, but it was something. His knees ached, his back tensed. He hadn't fought anyone in years, but he'd die before he let Thunder fall back into those hands. "He's gone now," Ben said, voice steady. "Left this morning." "You're sure about that?" Ben stared at them, then nodded toward the empty stall and the fresh tire tracks cutting through the gravel. "Pretty sure." One of the tall ones stepped forward, hand hovering over the pistol tucked into his waistband. "You make a habit of getting in the way?" Ben smiled, slow and humorless. "Only when it's worth it." The short one jerked his chin. "Rough him up." Ben moved first, not fast, but with the kind of precision that only comes from fighting. "For your life, more than once." He drove his fist into the taller man's nose, felt the crunch of cartilage. The man reeled back with a cry. The second lunged, but Ben ducked low and slammed his shoulder into his gut, sending him into the wall. With a thud, it didn't last long. They overwhelmed him, 2 to 1, fists pounding, boots crunching against ribs. Ben curled in, taking the blows, waiting for the right moment. When it came, he stabbed low, slicing the calf of the nearest man. A scream tore out of him. Blood sprayed across the pavement. "Enough!" the short one barked, pulling his pistol. Ben staggered up, arms raised, bleeding from his lip. "Do it!" he spat. The short man hesitated. Something about Ben, his eyes, his stillness gave him pause. A long silence stretched. Then the man holstered the gun. "You're not worth it." They left him there, bloodied but standing. Ben wiped the blood from his mouth, limped to the edge of the lot, and sat on the curb. He laughed once, bitter and painful. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm in it now." That night, someone took a photo of Ben as he limped back toward the vet's office where he'd been sleeping. The photo made its way online. A local animal shelter posted it, adding a caption, "Homeless veteran protects wounded Mustang from gang attack." Within hours, the story was everywhere. The post was shared 5,000 times before midnight. People commented from all over the country. Some offered donations, others wrote letters. But more than anything, people reacted to the image. The old soldier standing in front of the stall, arms spread, blood on his face, thunder behind him, watching like a guardian. Rachel saw it on her phone the next morning. She showed George, her hand trembling. "He didn't have to do that," she whispered. George nodded. "No, but he did." They called Ben that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring, voice hoarse but steady. "You all right?" Rachel asked. "I'll live. We saw what you did." He paused. "Didn't do it for you." "I know." He sighed. "But I'll keep helping. Not just for the horse, for whatever this is." Rachel hesitated. "It's a fight, Ben, a real one. Then maybe it's time I started swinging again." By that evening, a small movement had begun. Social media accounts tagged with Dash Warhorse and Dash Stand with Ben. A handful of veterans reposted the image. Local journalists called the shelter for more information. Someone started a GoFundMe. And Thunder, who once had been just a family's symbol of grief, was now becoming something much bigger. But not everyone liked it. Briggs saw the photo while sitting at a dive bar near the border. One of his lieutenants handed him the phone, with a grim face. "This him?" Briggs stared at the screen. The old man, the Mustang, the memory of being kicked still ached in his chest. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's him." "What do we do?" Briggs didn't answer right away. He scrolled through the comments. "That horse is a hero. This man deserves a medal. The Iron Vultures are terrorists, not bikers." He set the phone down, finished his drink, and leaned back in his chair. "Burn it all," he said. "The town? No." Briggs said coldly. "The story, the symbol, the pride. I want everything that horse represents turned to ash." Back in Wyoming, Rachel stood in the barn, brushing Thunder's mane, her hands gentle and slow. The bruises were healing, his eyes were calmer, but there was still a wildness in him, still a fight. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "They're going to come again." Thunder snorted, ears twitching. Rachel stepped back, her voice low and firm. "Let them." The first sign that the Iron Vultures were moving again came with the wind. It carried a foul smell of gasoline and burnt rubber mixed with something else, something more sinister. Rachel was out in the pasture with Jake, watching Thunder graze under a warming morning sun. The air had begun to lose its bite, the spring. Thaw creeping in. It should have been a peaceful day, the kind that gave a grieving family space to breathe. But peace didn't last in Willow's Creek anymore. It started with the smoke, thin trails rising in the distance, black against the sky, out near the old highway junction. By the time Rachel and George arrived to see for themselves, the veteran center was already a skeleton of fire and ash. The roof had collapsed in, windows burst outward from the heat. That building had served as a haven for dozens of local veterans over the years. It had housed job training programs, weekly support, groups and the town's only therapy dog. Now it was gone, reduced to rubble and silence, broken only by the hiss of smoldering timber. Rachel stood at the edge of the lot, fists clenched, heart pounding. There was no mistake. This was retaliation, a message, loud and brutal. People gathered slowly. Former soldiers, townsfolk, the mayor with his shirt untucked and eyes red. They whispered accusations, but no one said the gang's name out loud. Fear had begun to root itself deeper than anger. Only George stepped forward, picked up a charred remnant of the American flag that had once flown outside the building, and tucked it under his arm without a word. Later that day, Rachel walked Emily home from school. They passed the town library, now covered in bright red spray paint. The words leapt off the brick in bold, jagged letters. No more heroes, no more flags. The desecration stung. It was more than vandalism. It was a knife to the identity of their home. Symbols mattered in Willow's Creek. Flags, statues, cemeteries. They weren't just patriotic decor. They were legacies, reminders of who people had been and what they had endured. By evening, 5 more sites had been hit. A World War II memorial at the edge of town had its bronze plaques stolen. The cemetery gate was ripped off its hinges and left twisted on the road. A small church with a military service wall had its front door shattered, and the photos of fallen soldiers torn down and scattered in the mud. The whole town could feel the pressure building. People were afraid to speak up. The sheriff's department, already outmatched and underfunded, began turning down calls they knew they couldn't answer. Rachel noticed fewer people out after dark. Stores that usually stayed open until 9 were now closing before sunset. Even the diner, always a beacon of small-town stubbornness, locked its doors at 7, citing maintenance issues. Still, no one did anything except watch and whisper. Rachel couldn't sit still. That night she called Walter. His voice on the line was distant but firm. "They're pushing to fracture your town." "I know. They want to make us afraid of our own." "Shadow, you can't let them." "They're winning, Walter. We're outnumbered, not outwilled." She didn't respond right away. Thunder neighed in the background, restless, pouring at the ground in the barn. Walter continued, "This isn't about the horse anymore. You see that, don't you?" "Yeah," Rachel whispered. "It's about killing what's left of us." The next day, Briggs made it personal. It was morning when Rachel stepped onto the porch and saw the envelope nailed to the wooden column beside the door. She yanked it free, heart racing. Inside was a photograph. Emily, walking into the school gymnasium. Jake, eating ice cream on the sidewalk. Both pictures were recent, taken from close range. On the back was a single word, "Choose." Rachel dropped the envelope. The blood drained from her face. George found her minutes later, standing there, frozen. "Get the kids inside," she said, her voice shaking. George read the message, his lips pressing into a hard line. He didn't argue. Emily saw it on her mother's face, something cold and final, a switch flipping. Whatever innocence had survived this long burned out in an instant. "What's happening?" she asked. Rachel didn't lie. "They're watching us." Jake clung to her leg. Emily didn't cry. She just went to her room and closed the door. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, the photograph still in her hand. She was tired of being afraid, of holding her breath, of counting the days since Aaron died and wondering when the next loss would come. She stood up, grabbed her car keys, and drove into town. The sheriff was in his office, staring at a stack of reports he had no plan to file. She dropped the photo on his desk. "They're stalking my children." Burns looked up, his face pale. I'll look into it." "No," she said. "You won't, because you're afraid. Because you've already decided to let them take this town one piece at a time." "Rachel, I don't blame you," she said, surprising even herself. "You're a good man in a losing battle. But I'm not losing my children to this. I'm not burying more family. So get out of the way." She left without another word. When she got home, George was already packing a duffel bag. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said, "but if they come, I won't be unarmed." That night the final strike came. Rachel woke to the sound of a truck outside, idling, too loud, too close. She rushed to the window and saw a figure leap from the passenger seat, run to the porch, and hurl something into the yard. Then the truck peeled away into the night. George was already halfway to the door when it exploded, not a full detonation, but a message, a small blast. Enough to rattle the windows and scorch the grass. Rachel threw herself over Jake. Emily screamed. George burst through the smoke, unharmed but shaken. In the yard something burned. It was a flag, Aaron's burial flag, the one that had once been folded into a triangle and placed in Rachel's hands by a young army officer with trembling lips. Now it smoldered in the dirt, edges blackened, center still visible. Rachel dropped to her knees, hands trembling, and gathered the pieces into her arms. She didn't weep. George stood behind her, his voice hoarse. "They've declared war." Rachel rose slowly, eyes red with fury. "Then let's give them one." The air in Willow's Creek had changed. It wasn't just the smoke lingering from the scorched front yard or the whisper of ash caught in the wind. It was something colder, deeper. Rachel could feel it in the stares that met her in town. People no longer pitied her. They looked through her, like she was a walking consequence of courage, and no one wanted to be reminded of what that meant. The desecration of Aaron's flag had sent a shockwave through the town, but not the kind she had hoped for. No one rallied. No one raised their voice. Fear had won the first round. She spent that morning repairing the barn's north side, not because it needed it urgently, but because she couldn't sit still. The hammer in her hand gave her something to grip other than rage. Thunder paced inside his stall, still uneasy. George hadn't said much since the blast. He moved like a man trying to outrun the clock. He cleaned his shotgun twice, sharpened the blade he kept under the porch steps, reorganized the pantry by necessity, not preference. Cans of beans and soup placed beside spare batteries and a dusty first aid kit. Emily stayed close to her room, headphones in, eyes red from a night of silence. Jake followed Rachel everywhere. He wouldn't let go of her hand, not even while eating breakfast. Rachel didn't cry over the flag, not in front of them. But that night, when the house was still and George sat keeping watch from the porch, she crept into the old storage closet in the hallway. There, beside the coat rack and Aaron's packed footlocker, she knelt and unfolded what remained of the burial flag. It smelled of smoke. The fabric was torn at the edges, and the center, where the stars had once been pristine, was marred by a blackened smear that looked like a wound. She pressed her face to it, and finally allowed the tears to come, silent, hot, relentless. Aaron was gone. But now they had taken something sacred, something no one had a right to touch. It wasn't about cloth. It was about memory, honor, meaning. The next morning, Rachel called Ben. "I need you to do something for me." His voice on the other end was gravelly. "Name it. I want them found. Not all of them, just one." "Who?" "The one who took the flag." Ben didn't hesitate. "I'll ask around." Within 24 hours, word came back. A new video had surfaced online. Private, encrypted, shared through the dark corners of social media where the iron vultures thrived. In it, a masked man stood in front of the burned remains of a folded flag. He held it like a trophy, swinging it in the air before tossing it into a bonfire behind him. The video was short, less than 30 seconds, but it said everything. The flag, the fire, the laughter. George watched it once, then got up and left the room. Rachel couldn't move. Her hands were clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. Emily stood frozen at the doorway, her mouth trembling. Jake didn't understand what he was seeing. "Why are they laughing, Mom?" Rachel knelt beside him, wrapping him in her arms. "Because they don't know what it cost." Later that day, George disappeared for several hours. Rachel didn't ask where he went. She knew. He came back with fuel cans and boxes, ammunition, rope, maps. There was no ceremony about it. Just method, determination, the same look he had the morning Aaron deployed. "We're preparing," he said simply. "No more waiting." That night, while George took the truck into town, Rachel stood in the backyard with Emily. The stars above were faint, barely visible beyond the glow of porch light. "You doing okay?" Rachel asked. Emily shook her head. "I want to do something, but I don't know what." "You already are. You're still standing." Emily blinked hard. "That doesn't feel like enough." Rachel placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It never does, but you stay upright. You protect your brother. You protect the truth. That's more than enough." Emily looked away. "If they come again, are we ready?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "We will be." The next attack didn't come through fire or explosives. It came through humiliation. In the early morning, just before sunrise, dozens of town residents woke to find their homes marked with a symbol, spray-painted in black on fences, mailboxes, and garage doors. A crude V crossed with a diagonal slash, the mark of the iron vultures, but only certain houses were marked. Veterans, flag raisers, those who had shown support for Rachel's family in even the smallest way, retaliation for loyalty. One of those houses was the Harlan residence, an elderly couple who'd lost their son in Desert Storm. Their flagpole, once upright and clean, had been snapped in half. Their porch steps were soaked in gasoline, but never lit. Just a warning. Rachel drove over with George before the police could even respond. Mr. Harlan was sitting on his front steps, the broken flag still clutched in his hands. "They want us to be afraid," he said without looking up. Rachel sat beside him. "Are you?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with a voice hoarse from age and sorrow, he whispered, "Yes, but I won't give them what they want." Back home, Rachel found a box in the attic labeled Aaron High School. Inside were old photos, wrestling medals, notebooks, and at the bottom, a spare flag, one Aaron had used for youth drills. It wasn't the burial flag, but it was his. She unfolded it gently, the red and white stripes bright, despite the dust of years. That night, she raised it again on the pole outside the barn. Thunder stood watching as it rose, his ears twitching. Rachel didn't say a word, just tightened the rope, stepped back, and stared at the flag dancing in the cold wind. That same night, a small group of teenagers showed up at the Kingston property, quietly, nervously. 2 boys and 1 girl, high schoolers. One of them had a bruise on his jaw. The girl kept glancing over her shoulder. They didn't have much to say, only that they'd seen things, heard plans, knew the gang was getting ready for something bigger. "They don't like the attention your family's getting," the bruised boy said. "They're planning to shut it down, soon." Rachel looked at them, suspicion tightening her chest. "Why are you telling me?" The girl's voice cracked. "Because what they're doing, it isn't what we thought it was." She nodded toward Thunder. "That horse, it means something." Rachel offered them water, a place to sit. They refused. They didn't stay long, but before they left, the girl handed Rachel a piece of paper, an address scribbled in pencil, an old storage unit on the outskirts of the next town. "They've been meeting there," she said. "That's all I know." George looked at them in paper for a long time after they left. "They're slipping," he muttered. "Arrogance does that." Rachel stared at the address. Her pulse quickened. "They think they're untouchable." George folded the paper, placed it in his coat pocket, and looked up at the new flag flying outside. "They're about to learn otherwise." The map on the kitchen table looked more like a battlefield blueprint than anything belonging to a family. Ranch. Every highway, alley, and rural offshoot within 100 miles had been marked. Pins dotted the paper like scars, red for known biker sightings, yellow for vandalism locations, blue for suspected safe houses. George leaned over it, squinting. Through his reading glasses, one hand steady on the edge of the table, the other sketching in new lines with a red pen. His old instincts had returned with terrifying ease. Once, long ago, these skills had been used overseas. Now they were protecting home soil. Rachel stood at the window with her arms crossed, watching the old flag outside ripple in the wind. There was a heaviness in her chest she hadn't quite been able to shake. Not grief, exactly, but a pressure, like something important was about to shift. Thunder paced in the pasture, his limp more noticeable these days, his body leaner but still proud. Emily sat nearby with a notepad in her lap, jotting down patterns from the security footage they had begun collecting from sympathetic businesses around town. Jake, too young to understand the depths of what they were preparing for, had taken to shadowing his grandfather. He watched as George taught him how to coil a rope, how to hold a flashlight properly, how to spot movement in tall grass. Rachel worried it was too much too soon, but then again, innocence was a luxury that seemed to have expired in Willow's Creek. The information passed to them by the teens who'd visited, though limited, had been a catalyst. The address they'd given led to more than just an old storage unit. It led to discovery. Ben was the one who checked the place out first. Armed with a crowbar and a camera phone, he had approached the storage unit under cover of night. The locks were new. Too new. Inside, he found boxes filled with pamphlets, clothing patches, and propaganda, anti-government literature, symbols, Borrowed from hate groups, fuel canisters, spray paint, a board with a crudely drawn map of the town, with crosses over key locations, the town hall, the library, the Kingston Ranch. Most chilling was a note pinned beside the map. Take the pride from them, and they'll forget they were ever strong. Ben took photos of everything and sent them to Rachel. She stared at them on her phone for a long time, thumb frozen over the screen. It had never just been about thunder, or the flag, or even the town. It was about erasing the symbols that reminded people they mattered. She forwarded the images to George, who sent them to a contact in the State Patrol. But no response came. The law, it seemed, still refused to intervene, either out of fear or worse, indifference. "We do this ourselves," Rachel said. George didn't argue. That week they began the quiet gathering of allies. George called on 3 veterans from his old Marine unit, now living in neighboring counties. 2 said yes immediately. The 3rd didn't say anything at all. He just showed up 3 days later with a duffel bag and a face that looked like stone. Rachel coordinated with the local feed supply to use one of their empty barns for nightly meetings. Emily began recording license plates spotted near the property, checking them against public records. Some came up clean, others linked to men with charges that had simply disappeared: arson, weapons trafficking, assault. The town had unknowingly become a breeding ground for something larger than a biker gang. It was a network, and it was expanding. Lena Park, the tech-savvy contact Ben had introduced, finally arrived in person. She was younger than Rachel expected, sharp-eyed and quiet, with a laptop case slung over her shoulder like a weapon. She barely said a word as she set up her gear in the old barn's loft, but within hours she had access to traffic cameras, hacked social media accounts, and tapped burner phone pings. Her screens flickered with real-time data, lines of code and facial recognition scans. "I can't promise I'll find everything," she said, "but I'll find enough." And she did. Within 48 hours, she mapped out a series of meeting points, temporary encampments where the Iron Vultures gathered at night. Some were tucked deep into forest trails, others in abandoned barns or under railroad trestles. She intercepted a text chain from one of their encrypted channels. "Final run, 6 days, full pressure, no more warnings." Rachel stared at the message. "What does it mean?" "They're planning something big," Lena replied. "Coordinated. Probably not just for this town." George stepped closer. "Multi-location assault?" Lena nodded. "Would be my guess. It's not just chaos anymore, it's structure." Rachel looked at the board beside them, her fingers tightening around a marker. She drew a red circle around Willow's Creek. "Then we strike first." George raised an eyebrow. "How?" Rachel turned toward the room of allies. Ben, Lena, the veterans, even the local butcher whose son had served with Aaron overseas and never made it home. There were no generals here, no ranks, just resolve. "We leak a false meet-up location," she said. "Somewhere they think we're weak. We let them come. Then we show them they were wrong." Lena began typing, composing the message to be inserted into their network. Ben stood with his arms crossed, nodding. "What about the ones who stay behind?" George asked. Rachel turned to him. "That's why we don't go alone." They mapped out escape routes, fallback positions, communication, codes. Rachel insisted no one carry more firepower than necessary. "We're not here to kill," she said. "We're here to protect." Still, no one questioned when George lined the barn wall with hunting rifles and camo gear. The night before the plan was to go into motion, Rachel walked the perimeter of the ranch with Thunder beside her. The wind was cool, the stars bright. She leaned against the fence post and ran her hand down Thunder's neck. "You're part of something big, boy," she murmured. "You didn't ask for it, but neither did we." Thunder snorted softly and bumped her shoulder with his head. In the distance, a light flickered in the old barn. Plans were being finalized, allies prepared, and Rachel knew this was no longer about a vengeance. It was about preservation, of memory, of pride, of the very idea that some things, dignity, legacy, family, were worth defending even when the world turned away. When she returned to the house, she found George cleaning his old sidearm at the kitchen table. "Do you remember what you said to me when I told you I was pregnant with Jake?" she asked. He looked up. "No. What did I say?" "You said, 'The world needs more people raised by fighters.'" George smiled faintly. "Still true." Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's remind them who we are." The warehouse stood on the outskirts of a forgotten freight yard, half swallowed by weeds and time. Inside, Briggs paced like a caged animal, boots echoing against concrete as his men milled about in various states of agitation. Word had spread about the failed intimidation attempts in Willow's Creek. The burnt flag hadn't broken the Kingstons. The cemetery desecration had only stirred more quiet resistance. Now their own channels buzzed with rumors about armed veterans, about the Mustang they'd left for dead now guarded like treasure, about something more organized than any of them expected. Briggs didn't care for rumors. He cared for control. And he was starting to lose it. "They're getting bold," said Roper, his second in command. A burly man with a crooked nose and hands that looked like they'd been broken more than once. "Some of the younger guys are spooked. They say the town's turning against us." Briggs didn't stop pacing. "We don't need loyalty. We need fear. We made a mistake leaving the horse behind. It gave them something to rally around." Roper shrugged. "We could go back, finish it." Briggs spun on him, his voice low and cold. "No, that would make us predictable. What we need now is precision, power, not bikers with bruised egos. We need fire with direction." He walked over to a locked cabinet, opened it with a key around his neck, and pulled out a small burner phone. Only one number was stored on it. "You sure you want to do that?" Roper asked. Briggs didn't answer. He dialed 2 rings. Then a voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call." "They're building a defense network," Briggs said. "Ex-military, farmers, even the damn horse is a symbol now. We need to erase this problem." "Define erase. Permanent." A low chuckle came through the phone. "How many targets?" Briggs looked around at the gathered men. "All of them." "Then it's not a hit job. It's a cleansing, double rate, half up front." "Fine. Text me the coordinates. We'll be there in 48. The call ended. Briggs tossed the phone back into the cabinet and locked it again. He turned to Roper. "Tell the others. The ash wolves are coming." Roper's face changed. "The wolves? I thought they were—" "They're still alive. Still. Working. Just not for causes anymore, just for pay." Meanwhile, back in Willow's Creek, Rachel was tightening the final screws on a surveillance camera outside the barn. Lena's system was now fully wired, dozens of tiny cameras mounted. Along the tree lines, the road, the mailbox, even the chicken coop, all fed into her laptop upstairs in the loft, where she now slept in a sleeping bag and lived on coffee and granola bars. George walked up behind Rachel with a small hand radio. "We've got something," he said. "Interference on the west side." Rachel followed him around the pasture to where one of the smaller cameras was flickering on the live feed. Static filled the screen. Then for a moment, just long enough to send a jolt of dread, there was a glimpse of a face. Unfamiliar. Helmeted, military-grade gear, not a biker. Rachel stared at the screen. "That's not them." Lena tapped a few keys, zooming in. No patches, no colors. "Tactical gloves, night optics. These aren't iron vultures." George leaned in. "They're professionals." Rachel took a deep breath. "They've escalated." Later that night, Ben pulled up in an old pickup, his arm in a sling. From an earlier scuffle at a bus station 2 counties over, he stepped out, limped toward the porch, and tossed a folded newspaper onto the table. "Found this at a truck stop north of here." Rachel picked it up. On the front page was a grainy image of 3 men in black walking into a warehouse. The caption read, "Militia training grounds raided in central Idaho. Unknown group disappears before authorities arrive." George read over her shoulder. "The wolves?" Ben nodded. "That's them. They don't leave trails. But this time, they left a body. Head of security for a militia compound. Shot clean through the eye. No forced entry. No alarms tripped." Rachel looked at George. "They're ghosts." "No," George said, jaw tight. "They're wolves." The next morning, Emily spotted a white van parked just past the tree line near the back fence. It didn't move, just sat there. no logos. Tinted windows, Rachel called. It in. But by the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, the van was gone. They found tracks, though, and a single casing, a .308 round, clean, polished, placed deliberately in the grass like a calling card. They're scouting us, Lena said, analyzing the movement on the cameras. Studying shift changes, watching routines. They'll hit when they know the gaps. Rachel turned to George. We need to move the kids. George nodded. I'll take them to the Baker farm. Jake won't like it, but we can't risk it. That night, Rachel told Jake and Emily they were going to visit old friends for a few days. Emily understood. Jake didn't. I don't want to leave Thunder, he said, his voice cracking. Rachel knelt beside him, hands on his shoulders. He'll be here when you come back, I promise. Jake's eyes welled. Are you coming too? I can't. I need to stay and help Grandpa. Are the bad men coming? Rachel paused, then nodded. But we're not afraid of them, she said softly, because we know who we are. Jake nodded slowly, then threw his arms around her. She held him for a long time. The next day, with George driving them out of town, Rachel returned to the ranch with Lena and Ben, now moving like a true unit. They'd set up trip alarms, signal flares, escape hatches in the barn. The main house had been reinforced. Emergency radios were placed in every room, but nothing they did made her feel truly ready. The night before the attack, they received a final warning, a video sent directly to Rachel's phone. It showed a row of scarecrows dressed in military uniforms, each one with a flag patch burned off the sleeve. They were hanging upside down from trees, shot through the chest. A distorted voice spoke over the image. You made it a war. Now you'll see how we finish one. Rachel stared at the screen long after the video ended. Then she rose, walked outside to Thunder's stall, and opened the gate. The Mustang stepped out, tense but calm. She led him to the old training ring behind the barn, where Aaron had once taught him to trust again. She ran her hand down his mane. They think they know fear, she whispered. Thunder snorted, stamping the ground. They don't know us. The cold came early that morning, sliding down from the mountains in a silent tide, and with it came something else, something weightless, yet suffocating. Dread had a way of making itself known in the quietest hours. Rachel stood by the barn, with a steaming mug in her hand, watching her breath rise in thin clouds, her eyes scanning the tree line. Thunder moved inside his stall, still half asleep, but his ears twitched with every faint rustle in the woods. He felt it too, the stillness. Before something breaks. Inside the house, Lena was already awake, face lit by the pale blue glow of her monitors. The loft above the kitchen had become her war room. Wires snaked along the beams, power packs hummed. 2 battery-operated fans clicked steadily as she adjusted satellite feeds and scoured data threads. She hadn't slept in almost 2 days, and it showed in her posture, in the hollowness behind her sharp eyes, but she didn't seem to care. Her focus was absolute. Rachel stepped into the room, pulling her jacket tight. Anything? Lena didn't look away from the screen. Something. Not sure what it is yet. Define something. Lena leaned forward, tapped a few keys, and pulled up a map. Dozens of red dots blinked across it. Locations stretching across 5 states. These are sites hit in the last 3 months. Memorials, veteran centers, cemeteries, town halls, with historic plaques. At first I thought they were random, small-town vandalism with political flavor. But then, she swiped again. Another map, this time with green dots. These are staging. Grounds, abandoned buildings, unused fields, storage yards, all used by the Iron Vultures. Now watch this. She overlaid both maps. The pattern was undeniable. Every target of vandalism was within 20 miles of a known every single one. They're not just acting out, Lena said. They're executing something organized, coordinated, regionally mapped. Rachel stared at the screen. You're telling me this isn't about us, or the horse? Lena shook her head. You're a chapter. This is the book. Rachel sat down slowly. Her heart pounded. Why didn't we see this before? Because they didn't want us to. The attacks looked small, petty, easy to dismiss. Paint, fire, flags, but together, Lena gestured to the map. This is a movement. Rachel felt the floor tilt beneath her. We've been treating a wildfire like a campfire, she murmured. Ben walked in from the back door just in time to hear the last sentence. He tossed his coat over a chair, his face pale from the wind. I've been asking around. Truckers, drifters, folks that move between these areas. There's talk, quiet but spreading, about a new kind of uprising. Not just biker gangs, disillusioned. Ex-soldiers, survivalist groups, extremist enclaves. They're joining up. Joining up for what? Rachel asked. Ben hesitated, then said the word that no one wanted to. Collapse. He sat down and pulled a folded paper from his jacket. This is a manifesto. Found it at a rest stop near Billings. Someone left a box of them in the men's room, like a calling card. Rachel took it. The paper was cheaply printed. The words were bold and angry. When monuments fall, truth rises. When flags burn, lies die. A nation without myth is a nation that can rebuild. They're not just trying to destroy, Ben said. They think they're cleansing. Rachel stood and paced, the floor creaking beneath her boots. All this time, we thought it was personal. The horse, the attacks on the house, the flag. They were, Ben said, but not just as revenge. You became an example, a test case, and now that you didn't break, they're pushing harder. They need to prove. They can win. George entered then, eyes hard. Then we make sure they lose. They spent the day calling in every ally they had. Old veterans, ranchers, retired police, people who still believed in something greater than themselves. Some said no, some were too afraid, but enough said yes. By nightfall, the barn had been turned into a command post, maps pinned to walls, radios charging, firearms cleaned and stacked under a tarp. Not to start a war, but to withstand one. Rachel stood by the whiteboard, her voice calm, firm. They think they can break us by taking what we love, by mocking what we stand for, but they've misjudged something critical. She turned, met. Every pair of eyes. They've never seen what happens when a family fights back. Outside, Lena's laptop pinged. She ran to it, scanned the alert and went pale. They're moving, she said. All of them, convoys from 3 states converging on a single point. George leaned in. Where? Lena pointed at the map. Here. Silence fell over the barn. Ben checked the window. What time? 3 hours, maybe less. Rachel turned to George. Evacuation. George shook his head. Too late. Lena checked the screens again. They're bringing heavy equipment. ATVs, trucks with armor plating, helmets, military discipline. Ben cracked his knuckles. They're bringing a war. Rachel nodded. Then we meet them on the front porch. Everyone moved into position. Radio checks, perimeter alerts. Thunder was led to the far end of the barn, hidden behind hay bales. And fencing. Rachel stayed with him a moment longer than necessary, running her hands along his mane. If anything happens, she whispered, run, don't look back. Thunder neighed softly, nuzzling her chest. When she turned back, George was waiting with a vest in his hands. Kevlar's old, he said, but it still stops bullets. Rachel took it, strapped it on, and grabbed her rifle. The wind picked up, the moon climbed, and far down the road the sound of engines began to hum, not the ragged noise of unruly bikers. This was coordinated, disciplined, doom approaching on rubber wheels and painted metal. Rachel took her place by the gate. Lena sat behind her screens. George, Ben, and the others spread across the property, and just before the headlights broke over the hill, Rachel whispered a final vow into the dark. They tried to erase us. Then she lifted her rifle. Let's show them we're still here. The road to the Kingston ranch was long and winding, cutting through open prairie, like a ribbon laid out for the inevitable. And now that ribbon trembled under the weight of 20 motorcycles and 4 armored. Trucks crawling toward the horizon, their headlights carved through the dark, sweeping over dry grass and fence posts like searchlights in enemy territory. In the lead was Briggs, his gloved hands gripping the handlebars like he was holding onto the last piece of control he had left. Beside him rode 2 of the ash wolves, men who didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't need to be told what to do. They weren't bikers. They were instruments, cold, sharp, and made for cutting. Briggs hadn't smiled in days. Not since the footage had surfaced of the Kingston woman standing in front of a crowd of volunteers, raising that old American flag again, like she had something left to fight for. He'd seen it all, people rallying around her, the Mustang, the town. She had become a banner herself, and that wasn't just an insult to him. It was a threat. Symbols were dangerous. He knew that better than anyone. And symbols needed to be burned. Behind him, the convoy moved like a wave, uniform and determined. They had been given coordinates. Orders. There was no yelling, no showboating. This wasn't the usual ride into town to scare a few civilians. This was precision. This was an execution. But on the other side of the hills, in the shadows of the Kingston ranch, preparations had already been made. George stood behind the second-floor window of the old hayloft, a scoped rifle resting on sandbags. He had eyes on the southern road, and the trigger resting lightly against his calloused finger. Inside the house, Lena manned the radio station, her headset on, tracking every movement with chilling calm. "They're coming through the east side now," she said into the mic. 4 trucks, 20-plus hostiles, tactical gear, slow speed. Rachel crouched behind the barn's open gate, her rifle slung across her chest and a small earpiece pressed tight. Her breathing was steady, her pulse loud in her ears. She hadn't slept in 30 hours, but she felt sharper than she ever had. This wasn't fear anymore. This was focus. She looked down the line to Ben, crouched behind the fence post, his own weapon ready, eyes scanning the road. "Remember," she whispered into her mic, "we let them in. We make them believe we're fractured. Then we close the trap." At the center of the trap sat the bait. The main barn lights were on. Thunder was in his stall, visible through the open doors, but just barely enough to catch attention, to signal that they had returned to routine, to vulnerability. But above him, hidden among the beams and shadows, were 3 former soldiers with night vision scopes, each with a single target assigned. The goal wasn't to kill. The goal was to expose, to break the illusion of strength the iron vultures carried. Like armor. Lena's voice came through again. 5 minutes. Rachel nodded and tapped the signal twice. Across the property, small lights blinked once, ready positions confirmed. Then they waited. The first truck turned onto the gravel path, its tires grinding over stone like bone on bone. Then came the bikes, engines purring low, like wolves sniffing at a sleeping herd. They slowed as they reached the barn, headlights flicking off one by one. Silence fell over the land. Then came the voice. "Rachel Kingston!" Briggs shouted, stepping off his bike and walking into the yard. He wore a vest stitched with his gang's insignia, a scarf around his mouth, and eyes that looked like cracked ice. "You've got one chance to come out," he said, arms wide. "One chance to hand over the horse and step down from whatever fantasy you're clinging to." Rachel didn't move. Briggs turned in a slow circle. "You think you're heroes? You're nothing. A handful of old men and a stubborn woman who thinks she's Joan of Arc. But you're not leading a revolution. You're leading a funeral procession." He took another step. That was when the first spotlight hit. Blinding white beams flooded the yard from hidden towers mounted along the barn roof. The convoy froze, their shadows stretched long across the ground. Rachel stepped out, not from the barn, from behind. She emerged from the shadows of the southern fence line, with her rifle raised, flanked by Ben and one of the veterans. Dozens of other figures appeared from tree lines, hay bales, rooftops, all armed. All silent, surrounded. Briggs turned sharply, stunned. "I told you," Rachel said. "You came to the wrong place." At her signal, the makeshift perimeter closed. Guns didn't fire, no one moved. But the message was loud. This wasn't a town on its knees. This was a town standing tall. The iron vultures looked around, confused. Half of them were kids in leather. The other half, hardened men who hadn't expected to face an army. The ash wolves didn't flinch. One stepped forward, scanning the defenses. "This isn't your fight," Rachel called out to them. "You're hired hands, paid to play the villain. But you don't get to decide what this place means." The lead wolf removed his helmet. He was clean-shaven, cold-eyed, and didn't blink. "You won't shoot," he said calmly. "You care. Too much about your community, your kids, your principles." Rachel smiled tightly. "You're right, we won't." She raised her hand, but the sound that followed wasn't gunfire. It was a siren. Lena had triggered the emergency beacon, a direct signal to the state patrol. They'd been monitoring radio frequencies all night, waiting for confirmation. Moments later, floodlights swept in from the west, black SUVs, flashing red and blue. Uniformed officers spilled from the vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting orders. Briggs stepped back, shocked. "You lied," he hissed. "No," Rachel said. "I planned." The field erupted in chaos. Bikers scrambled. A few ran for their bikes, only to be tackled by deputies. The wolves didn't resist. They disappeared into the trees, melting into the dark like ghosts. But not all of them. One was caught by Ben near the pasture, taken down with a brutal elbow and a twist of the arm that snapped like dry wood. Briggs turned to run. George was waiting for him. The two men locked eyes across the yard. Briggs reached for a blade. George raised his rifle. "Don't," he said. Briggs froze, his breath visible in the cold. "You're finished," George said. For the first time, Briggs looked small, stripped of his show, surrounded, alone. He dropped the knife. Rachel walked over slowly, cuffs in hand. "You desecrated my brother's flag," she said, voice tight. Briggs looked up, defiant. "And I'd do it again." Rachel didn't hit him. She didn't scream. She just placed the cuffs around his wrists, locked them, and handed him off to the officers. "Good," she whispered. "Now you'll live to watch us rebuild." As the last of the gang was loaded into transport vans, the sun began to rise over the field. The shadows retreated. The cold lifted. And the Kingston Ranch, burned, battered, and scarred, stood whole, not because it had never fallen, but because it had stood back up. The sirens faded with the night, swallowed by the wide Wyoming plains. As the last of the patrol vehicles pulled away from the Kingston Ranch, what remained behind was a battlefield without fire, littered only with crushed grass, footprints, and the lingering weight of tension that had not yet fully lifted. His barn lights still burned, casting long golden beams across the property, but there was no celebration, no cheers, just quiet relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath for too long. Rachel stood alone in the yard, her hands in the pockets of her coat, watching the path where Briggs had been taken. She felt no triumph, only exhaustion, the kind that settled deep in the chest and didn't let go. Her face was smeared with dust, and her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but her gaze remained fixed. Not because she expected him to come back, but because the fight still echoed in her blood. George approached quietly, his boots barely making a sound on the gravel. He didn't speak. He simply handed her a bottle of water and stood beside her. "We did it," she said after a moment. He nodded. "Part of it." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" George stared at the horizon. This was the foot soldiers, the noise, but the ideology, that's still out there. Rachel took a slow breath. "So we keep building," he smiled faintly. "That's what wins in the end." She looked back toward the barn where Thunder stood quietly in his stall. His mane was tangled, and one of his flanks still bore the old scar from the night he was stolen. But his eyes met hers through the open door, unblinking, unwavering. He'd seen too much. Like them, he had changed. Rachel started toward him, but before she reached the barn, the radio on her hip crackled. Lena's voice came through, clipped and urgent. "We've got movement on the West Ridge. Lone figure, not one of ours." Rachel froze. "Armed?" "Can't tell. Approaching slow, deliberate, and get this." Thunder's acting strange, started pacing like he recognized something. Rachel turned her head sharply toward the barn. Thunder's ears were perked, his body rigid with attention. He snorted once, loudly, and began pawing at the ground. "Keep eyes on that ridge," Rachel said, her voice tightening. "George, with me." They jogged toward the edge of the property where the main path intersected with the old windbreak. The moon was still low, casting pale light between the trees. Then a figure emerged, alone, deliberate, stepping slow but steady. Rachel gripped her weapon tighter, but something about the walk, the posture, made her hesitate. Then the figure stopped and raised both hands. "I'm not armed," came the voice, steady, strained. "I just want the horse." Rachel stepped forward cautiously. "Identify yourself." The figure took 2 more steps, and the moon caught his face. It wasn't a stranger. It was Briggs. But something was wrong. His face was bloodied, his lips split, one eye swollen shut. He limped as he moved, and his coat, once pristine and stitched with the Iron Vulture's insignia, was torn, stained with dirt. "I escaped," he said. "You have to listen to me." George raised his weapon. "You're finished, Briggs. Whatever game this is, it's not a game," Briggs interrupted. "You think I was the top of the pyramid? You think I called the shots?" Rachel narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "They let me lead because I was loud," he said. "Because I was angry. I got attention, but I wasn't the source." Rachel took another step forward. "Then who?" Briggs pointed back toward the hills. "They're coming. The wolves. Not all of them were caught, and they're not coming for you this time." George's jaw clenched. "Why tell us?" Briggs looked at Thunder. "Because I tried to break that animal and I couldn't. Because you stood when no one else did. Because maybe I finally see what I tried to destroy." Rachel didn't believe him. Not entirely. But the fear in his eyes wasn't a lie. Before she could respond, Thunder let out a sharp cry. They turned to see him charging from the barn. The gate had been unlatched. The latch hadn't failed. It had been opened. Thunder galloped toward them, black mane flying, hooves pounding like drums against the earth. But he wasn't charging in panic. He was charging with purpose, toward Briggs. Rachel stepped back instinctively. George lowered his weapon. Briggs didn't move. Thunder stopped just short of him, skidding slightly in the dirt. His head came low, snorting, his breath hard and hot. Briggs didn't flinch. He raised his hand slowly. "I was wrong," he whispered. "You're not a symbol. You're a reckoning." Rachel moved forward. "You want redemption? You start with truth." Briggs nodded, his chest rising and falling like he had run 1,000 miles. "They're planning another hit," he said. "Bigger than this town. Multiple towns. They'll go after monuments, schools, veterans' events, anywhere people gather to remember." "Why?" George asked. "Because they believe if you erase memory, you erase resistance." Rachel stared at him, then looked at Thunder. He stepped closer to her, letting her rest her hand against his shoulder. His breathing slowed. "We need that list," she said. "I'll give it to you," Briggs said. "But I'm not staying. You don't get to walk away." "I'm not walking away," Briggs said. "I'm making it right, my way." 3 days passed, and the quiet that followed was deceptive. It wasn't peace. It was waiting, a breath held too long. Something in the wind had shifted, and everyone on the Kingston ranch felt it in their bones. The horses were restless. The dogs barked more at shadows than sounds. And Thunder, who had once paced and pawed at the ground in frustration, now stood still for hours, ears pricked toward the west, like he was listening for something no one else could hear. Rachel didn't sleep much. Neither did George. Lena barely left her post in the loft above the barn, and Ben had taken to sleeping in the saddle shed with a rifle across his chest. Everyone knew what was coming. They just didn't know when or where. The files Briggs handed over were extensive. Names, contacts, maps, timestamps, more than enough to get attention. But when Lena sent the full batch to the Department of Homeland Security, they received only a generic acknowledgement and a promise of review. No follow-up, no confirmation. It was the same silence they'd met before, and it said everything. They were still alone. until a coded message came in through one of Lena's backdoor channels. It wasn't from a government agency. It wasn't even from someone on their side. It was from the wolves. The message was simple. He talked. Now it ends. Rachel read it once and handed the paper to George. His lips thinned. They're going to make an example. What's the target? She asked. Lena stared at the screen, pale. I don't know yet, but there's chatter about the 4th of July. That's 5 days from now. They're planning something big, something symbolic, something final. Ben walked in from the porch, coat dusted with grit. I just came from the VFW. Word is the town's holding the parade again this year. Rachel looked up sharply. What? First one since the attacks. The council pushed it through fast, said it's time to move on. George's voice was low. They're giving the wolves a crowd. Rachel stood. We have to stop it. That afternoon, she drove into town and stormed into the mayor's office, slamming the folder of intel onto his desk. He looked at her with tired eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. You don't get to scare us anymore, Rachel. She stared at him. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to keep you alive. This town needs healing. People need something to believe in again. Rachel leaned forward. You don't heal by walking into a trap. The mayor looked away. I've got pressure from the council, the local press, business owners. If we cancel, we give them power. And I won't do that. Then post guards, sweep the grounds, do something. I've already assigned 2 deputies and 1 volunteer fire crew. That's all I've got. Rachel left the office sick to her stomach. Back at the ranch, she slammed the door behind her and paced the kitchen. They're going to hit the parade. George folded his arms. Then we go with them. We're not law enforcement. No, he said. We're better. We know what to look for. Lena began tracing the message back, combing forums, chat rooms, black market boards. After 6 hours, she found a clue. An order placed for ammonium nitrate fertilizer, purchased under a shell company with known ties to one of the wolves' aliases. A delivery scheduled for a warehouse near the train tracks. Rachel and Ben drove. Out that night under cover of darkness. The warehouse was quiet, its windows blacked out. They parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, crouched low, moving like they had during recon nights weeks earlier. Rachel held her breath as they neared a side door. Ben tried the handle. Locked. He pulled out a small pick, jimmied the lock quietly, and pushed the door open. Inside was darkness, thick and warm. They waited. No sound. Then Rachel flicked on her flashlight. Rows of stacked crates, bags, metal drums, and in the center, something that made her blood run cold. A van, white, unmarked, with the side door open. Inside were wires, bricks of compound, and a map taped to the interior wall. Rachel moved closer. It was a layout of Willow's Creek, and the War Memorial Park was circled in red. Rachel took a picture with her phone. Ben's voice was tight. We have to move now. They didn't hear the man until he was already behind them. A click of metal. Put it down, the voice said. They turned slowly. A man in black stood in the corner, pistol raised, face expressionless. Ben raised his. Hands. Rachel did the same. You're too late, the man said. Rachel kept her voice calm. This doesn't have to end like this. It never ends. Not until it all burns. Ben moved first. He dropped to one knee, sweeping Rachel behind him, and reached for his sidearm. The man fired once. Ben flinched, but the shot missed. Rachel lunged, grabbing the closest crate and hurling it toward the attacker. It slammed into his legs, and he stumbled. She tackled him, wrestled the pistol free, and knocked it away. Ben pinned his arms. They tied him with zip ties and dragged him outside. Rachel dialed George. We found it. The bomb. It's ready to go. Where? Memorial. Park. Parade day, George cursed. We'll need help. Back at the ranch, they laid out the plan. Lena kept scanning the networks for any backup detonators. George called every vet they'd worked with, every neighbor, every rancher. Word spread fast. This wasn't just about the Kingstons anymore. It was about the town. The morning of the 4th, Rachel woke early. The air was thick with tension, the sky overcast. She dressed in jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled high. Her sidearm was holstered under her jacket. Thunder stood saddled and waiting. They rode into town together, her leading. Him down the center street like a warning. People stared. The mayor approached. "What the hell are you doing?" Showing them what strength looks like, crowds began to gather, marching bands warmed up. Kids waved flags, and under one of the benches near the main platform sat the white van. Rachel signaled. George moved. With two others, veterans from neighboring counties, they surrounded the van and opened the door. Inside, exactly what they'd seen before. But this time, they had proof. Rachel turned to the crowd. "There's a bomb in this van," she said loudly. "We need everyone to evacuate now." People panicked, but her voice cut through. "Stay calm. Move west, away from the main park. This area is secure." Emergency services arrived within minutes. The bomb squad confirmed it, live, armed, and set to detonate during the flag ceremony. But it never did, because they stopped it, because they were ready. That night, as the fireworks bloomed over Willow's Creek, Rachel stood on the edge of the crowd, hand resting on Thunder's mane. The mayor approached quietly. "You saved them." Rachel didn't smile. "No, they saved themselves. We just gave them time to see how." He nodded, shame in his eyes. "You were right," he said. "I usually am." Thunder neighed softly, shifting under her hand. Above them, the sky cracked with color, and somewhere beyond the noise, Rachel finally exhaled. The fight wasn't over, but tonight they had won. The morning after the parade, the town of Willows. Creek was quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. Not the tense, heavy silence of fear, but the calm that comes in the wake of survival. Sunlight poured over the rooftops, dappling the streets where flags still waved gently in the breeze. Remnants of a celebration that had nearly turned into tragedy. The white van had been towed away during the night, and the bomb squad had worked until dawn, securing the remaining evidence. Still, there were no victory speeches, no headlines. Only the slow, unspoken acknowledgement that something terrible had been prevented because ordinary people had chosen not to be afraid. At the Kingston Ranch, Rachel moved through the kitchen with a weariness she couldn't quite shake. She poured herself a cup of coffee, staring out the window toward the pasture where Thunder stood grazing, his dark coat catching the morning light like a piece of living iron. For the first time since Aaron had died, she felt the ache in her chest shift. Not gone, but lighter, manageable. She stepped outside and walked toward the barn. George was already there, stacking the last of the crates from their makeshift command post. The boards had been removed from the windows. The old hayloft was back to holding hay. Lena had packed up her equipment and left just after sunrise, disappearing with the same quiet efficiency she'd brought with her. Rachel leaned against the stall beside her father. "She said anything else about the wolves?" George shook his head. "Only that some of them scattered. Few names popped up in Colorado, others in the Dakotas. But for now, it's quiet." Rachel nodded. "I'll take quiet." A soft, shuffling sound came from behind them, followed by a familiar voice. "Thought you folks might need a hand." They turned. Walter stood in the barn's doorway, his coat dusty, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He looked thinner than the last time they'd seen him, his beard fuller, but his eyes were clear, sharp in a way they hadn't been before. Thunder perked up at the sound of his voice, ears twitching, head turning. Rachel smiled. "You picked a good day to come back." Walter stepped inside, setting his bag down gently. "Heard what happened, checked the news, such as it was. Didn't say much, but enough to know you folks didn't flinch." George extended his hand. "We wouldn't have gotten this far without the heads up you gave us." Walter took the hand and shook it. "I owed your boy. Still do." Rachel watched him walk over to Thunder. The Mustang didn't back away. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his head as Walter reached up and brushed a hand along his mane. "You remember me, don't you?" Walter whispered. "You got more sense than most." Rachel stepped closer. "You staying long?" Walter didn't answer right away. Then he looked over his shoulder. "I don't got much waiting for me anywhere else, but if there's a stall and something to keep my hands busy..." Rachel smiled again. "We'll build you a room in the old tack house. It's dry, has good light, needs fixing." "I like fixing things," he said quietly. "Always have. Just didn't always know how to fix myself." Thunder let out a soft huff. Nudging Walter's arm, George crossed his arms. "You're welcome here, long as you want." Walter nodded, and for a long moment none of them said anything. Later that day, Rachel found Emily sitting on the back porch, watching Jake chase a pair of barn cats through the yard. The boys' laughter rang through the air, high and wild. Like the last few weeks had been nothing more than a bad dream. Emily held a small journal in her lap, her pen tapping against the paper. Rachel sat beside her. "What you writing?" Emily hesitated. "I'm trying to figure out how to explain it, what happened, why it mattered. But every time I start, I feel like I'm not saying it right." Rachel nodded. "Maybe you don't need to explain it. Maybe you just tell it." Emily looked at her mother. "Is it over?" Rachel followed her gaze out toward the pasture, where Walter was brushing Thunder's coat in slow, rhythmic strokes. "No," she said softly, "but we've turned the page." That night, they had dinner outside. Ben returned from town with 3 bags of groceries and an old guitar he'd found at a thrift store. George grilled chicken. Rachel made sweet tea. Emily braided Jake's hair just to make him laugh. Even Thunder seemed at ease, standing near the fence, tail flicking lazily. "At flies." Walter sat at the edge of the table, plate clean, hands resting on his knees. He hadn't said much during the meal, but no one minded. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the light turned gold, he stood and walked into the barn. A few minutes later, he returned with a stool and a brush. He settled beside Thunder and began grooming him again. Rachel watched from the porch. He moved gently. No rush, no agenda. Just a man doing something simple and kind, like it meant everything, and for him, it did. When the stars came out, Rachel wandered over. Walter looked up, eyes glassy. "He was alone when I found him," he said, "tied up like he was nothing, but I saw it in his eyes. He was waiting for someone to prove him wrong." Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. "You both were." Walter chuckled softly. "Yeah, maybe we saved each other." She sat beside him. Thunder shifted, nudging her shoulder. Walter cleared his throat. "I've spent a long time trying to disappear, thought it was easier, thought the world didn't need another broken soldier wandering around." He looked at the barn, then the house, then back at Thunder, but maybe I was wrong. Rachel reached out and placed a hand over his. "You were never nothing, Walter. You just needed to come home." Thunder let out a long exhale, and the 3 of them sat there in silence, the stars watching from above. Back inside, Emily finished her journal entry. She didn't write about the battles or the bombs. She didn't mention names or dates or maps. She wrote about a man who stayed when he didn't have to, a horse that survived when he wasn't supposed to, and a family that stood when everything tried to knock them down. She called it redemption, and when she finished the last sentence, she smiled, because some stories don't need to end in fire. Some end in quiet and in hope. The morning sky above Willow's Creek glowed with the first colors of late summer, pale pink brushing into soft gold, the kind of sunrise that looked like forgiveness. The town had been quiet for a long time, cautious in its return to routine, as if people weren't quite ready to believe the worst was finally over. But now, in the last weeks of July, something had changed. There was motion again. Laughter. The sound of hammers on wood and voices shouting across yards. Not everything had been fixed, but enough had. At the Kingston Ranch, the barn stood tall, its roof newly shingled, the fence line repainted in fresh white slats. The burn marks from earlier attacks were gone, scrubbed and sanded away by a group of volunteers who had shown up one morning without being asked. They just came, with buckets, paintbrushes, tools, and worked until sundown. No speeches, no photos, just quiet solidarity. Rachel stood near the barn door, watching Thunder trot the edge of the pasture, his stride stronger now, more confident. The scar down his flank was still visible, but it no longer told a story of weakness. It had become something else, a mark of survival, of memory. When he ran like a ghost had been lifted from his back. George stepped out onto the porch with a thermos in one hand and a stack of envelopes in the other. "You've got more mail." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "More?" He handed them over her. She flipped through the stack, letters from schools, community centers, veterans groups, people from across the country writing to thank her family for what they'd done, for standing up, for holding the line. Some enclosed drawings from children, flags, horses, one that showed a woman with long brown hair holding a rifle beside a black Mustang. Rachel smiled and tucked it in her back pocket. George took a sip from his thermos and watched Thunder in the distance. "You remember when this place used to be quiet?" Rachel nodded. "Sometimes I miss that." "I don't." She looked at him. He smiled faintly. Quiet never changed anything. The town itself was still healing. The war memorial, once defaced, had been cleaned and restored. A new plaque had been installed, this time with names not just of fallen soldiers, but of those who had stood during the recent threat. Rachel hadn't asked for her family to be included, neither had George, but their names were there, etched in bronze beneath a simple phrase, "For those who stood when it mattered most." The Veterans Center had reopened, funded now by donations from all over the country. Lena had returned briefly to help them set up new security systems before disappearing, again into her world of encrypted networks and digital shadows. Before leaving, she handed Rachel a flash drive. "If anything like this happens again," she said, "don't wait. Call me." Ben had taken a position at the center, working with troubled youth and counseling former service members. Most days, he still wore that old ball cap, the one with the faded unit patch, and carried himself like a man who had finally found solid ground under his feet. He'd taken to dropping by the ranch every few days to bring feed, share stories, or simply sit on the porch and watch the wind roll across the field. And Walter, now with his own room in the refurbished tack house, had become something of a local legend. Kids waved to him from the road. A few people even stopped by just to shake his hand. He didn't like the attention, but he didn't shy from it either. Most days he was up before sunrise, brushing Thunder or checking fences, humming low songs no one recognized, but everyone found comforting. On one particular afternoon, a school bus stopped near the ranch gate. A group of children stepped out with clipboards, wide eyes, and a nervous teacher trying to keep them in line. Rachel met them halfway down the drive. "We're here for the project," the teacher explained. "They're doing reports on American symbols and, well, we were hoping to meet Thunder." Rachel smiled. "You came to the right place." Thunder, sensing the visitors, trotted toward the fence and stopped just short of the children. One boy dropped his pencil. Another girl gasped. "He's real," she whispered. Walter stood nearby, hands in his pockets. He glanced at Rachel, then leaned down toward the children. "You know what makes him special?" A boy shook his head. "He ran when they wanted him to fall, and he came back when it would have been easier to stay gone." Rachel watched the children scribble their notes, sketch the horse, and whisper questions about courage and war and symbols. She felt something swell in her chest. Not pride, exactly, more like gratitude. A quiet thankfulness that the story hadn't ended in ashes, that something had been built from everything that had been torn down. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the ranch was bathed in amber light, George stepped out of the house carrying a folded American flag. It was the one that had been destroyed and then repaired, stitched together by a veteran's widow from down the road using pieces from her husband's old uniform. It didn't look new. It didn't need to. Rachel followed him to the pole near the barn. Together, they raised it slowly, deliberately. Thunder stood nearby, watching. When it reached the top, George stepped back and saluted. Rachel placed a hand over her heart. For a long time, they said nothing. Then Jake's voice broke the silence. "Is it always going to be like this now?" he asked. Rachel turned to her son. "What do you mean?" "This. Strong, brave," she smiled. "It'll be whatever we make it." Emily stepped onto the porch, holding a photo she'd developed from a disposable camera one of the students had brought. It showed Thunder standing against the morning sky, Maine, caught in the breeze, flag flying behind him. She handed it to Rachel. "Thought you'd want this." Rachel stared at the image for a long time. Then she turned to the field, to the barn, to the sky, and for the first time since Aaron had left for Afghanistan, she felt like she could breathe again. The town had not just survived. It had risen, and it wasn't just alive. It was awake. The phone call came early, just after dawn, while Rachel was still pouring coffee into the chipped mug she'd used every morning for years. George was out feeding the horses, Jake was chasing after the barn cats in his pajamas, and Emily was upstairs getting ready for the community storytelling event at the school. The house had finally returned to some rhythm of normal life, though. The memory of recent months still lingered in the corners like faint shadows. When the landline rang, a rare occurrence in itself, Rachel picked it up more out of habit than expectation. "Kingston residence," she said. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, with just enough warmth to sound human. "Mrs. Kingston, this is Julia Ramirez, from the Office of Rural Community Affairs in Washington, D.C. I believe you've been expecting someone to call." Rachel's brow furrowed. "I wasn't." There was a pause, followed by a smile in the woman's tone. "Well, maybe not expecting, but perhaps hoping." The call was longer than she'd anticipated. It wasn't just small talk. Julia explained that the events in Willow's Creek had reached federal attention, not through official channels at first, but through word of mouth, through video clips and letters and testimonies from people who'd seen what had happened. The town's resistance, the protection of the memorial, the recovery of Thunder, all of it had become more than a local story. It had traveled. "I'm calling," Julia said, "because we believe what happened in your town matters beyond the borders of Wyoming. It's a story about resilience, family, and the preservation of our shared national identity. We'd like you and your father to come to Washington and speak." Rachel blinked. "Speak?" "To the Committee for Rural Preservation and Patriotism. It's a congressional roundtable. They're reviewing national responses to internal threats, particularly those targeting cultural and historic symbols. Your testimony could make a difference." Rachel's first instinct was to say no. She didn't want cameras. She didn't want microphones or reporters with shallow smiles. She wasn't a speaker. She was a mother, a farmer, a woman who'd simply refused to let her family be erased. But when she stepped out onto the porch and saw George wiping his hands on a feed sack, his back straight as ever despite the years, something settled inside her. "Okay," she said, "we'll come." The same arrangements happened quickly. The government covered the travel, booked them a modest hotel, and even arranged for Walter to look after the ranch while they were away. Rachel offered to pay him, but he waved her off. "You're doing something important," he said. "I've got Thunder, the dogs, and 3 days of quiet. That's more than enough for me." The morning they left, Emily and Jake stood in the yard holding small American flags. Rachel knelt to hug them both, whispering promises to return before the weekend. George packed his old dress coat, the one he hadn't worn since Aaron's funeral, and insisted on polishing his boots until they looked like they belonged to someone. 20 years younger, they flew out of Billings on a cloudless afternoon. Rachel had never been to Washington. Neither had George. The city was overwhelming. Stone monuments, traffic, the low buzz of power that seemed to seep from every corner. They were met at the airport by a woman in a navy suit who introduced herself as a liaison and escorted them straight to their hotel. The next morning they walked into the Capitol. Security was tight, the hallways cold and bright. Rachel kept her eyes ahead, trying to push down the knot in her stomach. George walked beside her like he belonged there, and maybe he did. When they entered the committee room, Rachel saw the cameras, the microphones, the rows of government officials sitting behind nameplates and notepads. There was no audience, no spectators, but she still felt exposed, like she'd stepped onto a stage she didn't ask to be on. They were seated at a table near the center. 2 microphones, a pitcher of water. Rachel's hands trembled slightly. As she reached for the glass, the chairwoman, a woman named Representative Holston, began the session. "Mrs. Kingston, Mr. Kingston, thank you for joining us. We understand this may be uncomfortable, but we hope you'll share with us, in your words, what happened in Willow's Creek. Not just the events, but what they meant, what they mean." Rachel nodded. She opened the folder she'd brought with her. Photos, timelines, letters. She had prepared a speech, but when she looked up and saw the expectant faces watching her, she closed it again and spoke from her heart. She told them about Aaron, about the way he had brought Thunder home, about the night the horse was stolen, and what it meant to lose the last living connection to her brother. She talked about the flag being burned, about the children waking up afraid, the barn cameras, the veteran center fire, the vandalized cemetery. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just told the truth. George spoke next. He didn't tell war stories. He didn't ask for sympathy. He spoke about the idea of home, about how symbols matter, not because of what they're made of, but because of what they carry. He spoke about dignity, about standing when everyone else had run. When they finished, the room was silent for several seconds. Then Representative Holston leaned forward. "Do you believe patriotism is alive in rural America, Mrs. Kingston?" Rachel met her eyes. "I don't think it ever left." After the hearing, they were taken to the National Mall for a private walk. The guide led them to the Lincoln Memorial. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the stone steps. The reflecting pool shimmered with orange and gold. There was a small crowd gathered nearby, visitors mostly, and standing in the center, next to the monument, was a sight Rachel hadn't expected: a military honor guard and a path cleared for Thunder. The horse had been transported in secret, an idea orchestrated by Walter and Lena, with help from a quiet donor who had seen their story and wanted to make a gesture. The handler led Thunder carefully across the grass, his hooves nearly silent. He didn't spook, didn't falter. He stood tall beneath Lincoln's gaze. Rachel felt her throat close. George stepped forward, hand over his heart, and someone in the crowd began to sing softly, "America the Beautiful." More voices joined. Rachel stood beside her father and her brother's horse, looking up at the statue carved from cold stone, and felt something warm bloom inside her. It wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was something gentler, something like healing. When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in deep orange and fading gold, Rachel reached out and placed a hand on Thunder's neck. "You brought us here," she whispered, and in the hush of that moment, beneath the stone figure of a man who had carried a nation through fire, it was enough. The air in Willow's Creek was different when Rachel and George returned from Washington. It wasn't just the late summer warmth or the lazy rhythm of the town getting back to normal. It was the way people looked at them, not with pity anymore, not with hesitation, but with something closer to reverence. Strangers nodded as they passed. A few stopped to shake hands. Some simply watched them walk by like they were witnesses to something sacred. Rachel didn't care about the attention. She hadn't gone to Washington to be admired. She'd gone to tell the truth, but it was impossible to ignore the shift. The town had begun to stand taller, speak louder, and look itself in the eye again. The scars were still there, but the shame was gone. Back at the ranch, life found its rhythm again. Walter tended to the horses each morning. Ben returned to his rounds at the Veterans Center. George repaired the west fence by hand with Jake at his side, teaching him how to tie knots and check for weak spots, like it was a sacred ritual passed down from a time before violence threatened to wash it all away. And Thunder was different too. He had taken to standing by the main gate, watching. The road calm but alert. His strength had returned fully. The limp that once haunted him was now a slight hitch, barely noticeable unless you looked hard. Rachel swore he had changed in Washington, like even he understood the importance of that moment beneath Lincoln's gaze. He carried himself with purpose now, not just as a survivor, but as a sentinel. What surprised Rachel most in those weeks after their return weren't the letters or the media requests or even the modest crowd that sometimes gathered near the ranch to leave tokens or messages. What surprised her were the kids. It started with one, a boy named Tyler, 17, tall, quiet, with a shaved head and the kind of shoulders that looked like they were used to carrying burdens too big for his age. He showed up one afternoon near the gate, hands in his pockets, eyes down. Rachel saw him from the barn and approached slowly. "You looking for someone?" He nodded, not lifting his gaze. "You." She waited. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a black bandana, folded tightly. He held it out to her. "I used to wear this, couple months back. Thought it meant something." Rachel didn't take it, not yet. "You were with them?" He nodded. "Not official. Never patched in. But I was there. Watched. Drove once or twice. Thought they stood for something, that maybe they'd help people like me feel strong." Rachel studied his face. "Did they?" He shook his head. "No. They just wanted to burn things." There was a long silence between them. Then she reached out and took the bandana. "What do you want now?" Tyler looked her in the eyes for the first time. "I want to build something." That same week, 2 more teenagers showed up, then 5, then a dozen. Some had family tied to the Iron Vultures. Others had simply followed the pull of rebellion, searching for something bigger than their boredom, their pain, their silence. They weren't bad kids, just lost, untethered, looking for someone to tell them what to stand for. Rachel didn't turn them away. Instead, she gave them work. She organized weekends at the ranch, fence mending, hay baling, barn repair. Not just chores, but structure, purpose. She gave them food, water, and space to speak. And when they didn't speak, she let them work until they found the words. George watched them from the porch, sometimes shaking his head, other times smiling. "They remind me of us," he said one evening. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Us? Before. The discipline. Before the code. When we were just wild kids with too much anger and no direction." Rachel laughed softly. "I don't think I was ever wild," George smirked. "That's because you always knew what you stood for. These kids never had that, but now they might." One afternoon, Emily came into the kitchen with a girl trailing behind her. "This is Lauren," she said. "She wants to talk to you." Rachel dried her hands on a towel and turned toward the girl. She was small, with sharp eyes and a nervous twitch in her shoulders. Rachel smiled gently. "You okay?" Lauren nodded. "My dad, he was one of them. Part of the gang. I didn't know everything at first. He said it was about freedom, about being left alone." Rachel waited. "But then I saw what he did. I saw the video of the flag. And your horse. And you." Her voice cracked. Rachel stepped forward and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "It's not your fault. I want to help," Lauren said, her voice small. "I can paint. I can build things." Rachel smiled. "Then let's build." Within weeks, the ranch had become more than a homestead. It had become a community. The youth that once flirted with rebellion now gathered on Saturdays with scrap lumber and buckets of paint, building benches, repainting the memorial wall, planting flowers along the fence line. They called it the Thunder Project. Emily helped them create a simple website, and soon other towns reached out, asking for guidance. Photos spread of teenagers working beside veterans, of children painting flags on old barn wood, of thunder standing tall beside rows of bright young faces. Not all were ready to forgive. Some in town were skeptical. "They were part of the problem," one woman said at the diner. Rachel happened to be there. "They're trying to be part of the solution," she replied. "That's what matters." When word reached the high school principal, he invited Rachel to speak during assembly. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't bring notes. She stood on the stage, hands at her sides, and looked out over the crowd of young faces. "I've seen what fear can do," she said. "It can turn neighbors into enemies. It can make you hurt people you've never even met. But I've also seen what courage can do. And it doesn't take a hero, it takes a choice." She told them about Aaron, about thunder, about the flag and the fire and the quiet victory of still being here. Every one of you will be asked sooner or later to pick a side. Maybe not in a war, maybe not in a fight, but in your heart you'll be asked to choose between destruction and healing, between silence and standing up. I hope, when that day comes, you remember what happened here. There was no applause. Just a room full of young people listening. Later that night, Rachel returned home to find a letter on her porch. No return address. Inside was a single note scrawled in ink that looked rushed. "You gave my daughter a second chance. Thank you." It wasn't signed. She folded it gently and slipped it into the drawer beside Aaron's last letter. In the field, thunder whinnied, the sound carrying through the dusk like a call to anyone still listening. And from the town that once trembled in silence, the answer had begun to rise. Summer melted into fall, and the days began to shorten, their golden light softening into the kind of warmth that came less from the sun and more from within the people of Willow's Creek. The memory of what the town had endured was still there, in the rebuilt fence posts, the patched barn siding, and the careful way neighbors looked out for one another. But what had taken root was something deeper, lasting. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had transformed, reshaped into purpose. It started small. A group of teenagers from a town 2 hours north sent a letter to Rachel, asking if they could visit the ranch. They'd heard about the Thunder Project, seen the pictures of the painted benches and flower beds, read stories about the youth who'd once worn the wrong colors and now wore tool belts and carried shovels instead of anger. Rachel said yes. Of course. When they arrived, they brought their own tools, their own wood, and their own stories. One boy had lost his brother to a gang, another had dropped out of school, but wanted to build something to feel whole again. They worked for a weekend, ate around the fire, and left with dirt on their clothes and hope in their eyes. Then came the invitations. A school in Montana asked Rachel to speak, then another in Idaho, then a church in Nebraska. Rachel didn't want to leave the ranch often. There was still work to do, and Thunder didn't like being alone, but she began to send out letters, videos, simple guides for anyone who wanted to start their own Thunder project. Not a blueprint for perfection, just a starting place for healing. Fix a bench, paint a mural, plant a garden in a place that once held anger. Honor a flag, not because it's flawless, but because it has endured. People responded. Veterans in Kansas rebuilt their post and named it the Aaron Kingston Hall. A group of high schoolers in rural Texas made a documentary about their grandparents, military stories, and sent Rachel a copy. She watched it twice, then mailed them a letter thanking them for remembering. A community center in Ohio painted a full mural of thunder across its outer wall, mane flowing, eyes fierce, the flag in the background. They titled it, "What Stands Still Stands." The media tried to keep up. Journalists wrote articles calling it the Quiet Movement or the Rural Reclamation. But Rachel never cared much for headlines. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted people to remember what mattered, what was worth holding on to. One afternoon, George walked into the barn with a yellow envelope in his hand. "More mail," he said, handing it to Rachel. This one came with a medal. Rachel opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from a retired colonel in Virginia. He'd seen a segment on local TV, read Rachel's testimony to the committee, and felt something stir in him that he thought had long gone quiet. Enclosed was his silver star. "I've held on to this for 50 years, the letter read, "but I think you've earned it more than I ever did. I fought for something I believed in. You're building it back from the ashes." Rachel sat down on the stall bench, staring at the medal in her hand. It was heavy, cool to the touch, the kind of weight that didn't press. It steadied. She handed it to George. "I think he meant this for you too." George didn't speak. He looked at the star, then nodded once and slipped it back into the envelope. Out in the pasture, Thunder galloped in a wide arc, kicking up dust and wind as he moved. A small group of kids watched from the fence, wide-eyed, notebooks in hand. "Is he always that fast?" one asked. "Only when he wants to be," Rachel said, smiling. Walter walked up beside her, a water bucket in one hand. "They're saying Thunder should be on a stamp," he said. Rachel chuckled. "A stamp?" Walter nodded. "Or a statue. I heard a school in Missouri named their mascot after him." Rachel shook her head, amused. "He's just a horse." "No," Walter said. "He's a reminder." She looked at Thunder again and realized Walter was right. Thunder wasn't just a horse anymore. He was what people saw when they thought of resilience, of memory, of defiance in the face of destruction. At night, around the fire pit near the edge of the ranch, people came from other towns to sit, to talk, to listen. No speeches, no slogans, just voices rising and stories shared. One by one, people who had once been afraid to say what they believed began to speak again. A woman from Utah told a story about her father, a soldier buried in a small cemetery whose grave had been vandalized last year. A man from Arizona shared how he had spent 2 decades feeling disconnected from his service until he saw a photo of Thunder and remembered what it meant to protect something. Rachel sat beside them, never claiming authority, never leading, just present. When Emily suggested creating a traveling exhibit, photographs, videos, letters, Rachel helped her gather materials. The exhibit was simple but powerful. It was titled Still Here. It traveled first to local libraries, then to small museums, then across state lines. People left notes beside the displays. "You helped me remember who I am. My son asked to fly the flag again. I thought we were alone. Thank you for proving otherwise." Not everyone was ready to forgive. Some who had once sided with the Iron Vultures stayed silent, but a few came forward. One man, a former gang runner named Cal, showed up at the ranch gate one morning with a box of old patches and a folded leather vest. He didn't say much, just handed the box to George and said, "I'm done running." George took the box, looked him in the eye, and said, "Then start walking forward." Ben, who had once lived in silence and shadow, now stood weakly at the town center with a small group of volunteers, helping local teens find jobs, teaching them how to change oil, fix fences, write resumes. Rachel caught him one afternoon giving Jake a lesson in how to fix a tire. Jake laughed when the tire rolled down the slope and hit the side of the barn. Ben just grinned. "You'll remember this more than you'll remember history class," he said. As fall turned to early winter, the first frost dusted the fields like a blanket of silver. And one morning, as the sun broke through the cloud line, Rachel stood at the edge of the property with her arms folded, watching as 2 delivery trucks arrived. From them came boxes of donated supplies, tools, books, uniforms. People weren't just watching anymore. They were joining, helping, believing. George stepped beside her, sipping coffee from his dented thermos. "You ever think it'd go this far?" Rachel shook her head. "I just wanted to get Thunder back." George looked toward the horse, who now stood near a new sign posted at the edge of the property. "Welcome to Thunder's Stand, a place to rebuild, a place to remember." And underneath, in smaller letters, "Still here, still proud, still free." The morning of July 4th came with clear skies and the kind of warmth that wrapped Willow's Creek in quiet reassurance. Flags hung from every porch. Red, white, and blue ribbons danced in the breeze, and laughter echoed from Main Street as neighbors greeted one another like it had been years since they last spoke, though most had walked this very street together. Through fire and fear, Rachel stood by the gate, hands resting on the fence, watching Thunder graze under the rising sun. He had been groomed for the occasion, his coat glossy, mane brushed smooth, and a small blue ribbon braided into his forelock. He didn't mind. He stood still, regal, as if he understood the wait. of the day. George walked up beside her in his pressed denim jacket and clean boots, the same ones he'd worn to testify in Washington. "Ready?" he asked. Rachel smiled. "As we'll ever be." Down in town, the parade was already lining up. School kids waved miniature flags. Old men leaned on canes, dressed in faded uniforms, medals pinned proudly to their chests. Farmers brought their tractors. Fire trucks gleamed in fresh coats of polish. And in the middle of it all, a handmade wooden float stood waiting, painted red, white, and blue, with two simple words etched on its side: Thunder's Stand. Thunder would lead the parade this year. It was the committee's idea, unanimous and without hesitation. Walter arrived with the trailer and helped load the horse gently. Rachel rode in the back, reins in hand, her other hand resting on Thunder's shoulder. He didn't need to be led. He knew the road. As they reached Main Street, the crowd erupted into applause. Not the loud, frenzied kind. It was steady, earnest, grateful. Rachel looked out at the faces. People who had once trembled behind closed doors now stood tall in the open sun, clapping, waving, standing shoulder to shoulder. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, mothers wiped tears from their cheeks, veterans saluted as Thunder passed. Emily and Jake rode in the float behind, waving proudly. George marched beside them on foot, and for the first time, there was no fear in the eyes around them, just light, just pride, just home. Thunder walked calmly through it all, head high, hooves steady, and when he reached the town square, where the old war memorial stood, now restored and surrounded by flags, he stopped. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at the monument like he'd been waiting to come full circle. Rachel leaned forward and whispered, "We're here. We made it." The crowd quieted, and in that hush, a single trumpet began to play the Star-Spangled Banner. Thunder didn't move, neither did anyone else. The anthem rose over the rooftops, through the fields, and into the hearts of everyone who had stayed, who had stood, who had fought to reclaim what mattered. When the last note echoed into silence, Rachel closed her eyes and breathed. They hadn't just survived, they'd built something new, and they were finally ready to celebrate it. The days after the parade passed gently. Life returned to its rhythm, school, chores, morning rides, and quiet evenings under the stars. But something had settled over Willow's Creek, something that hadn't been there before. Peace. Not the fragile kind born of silence, but the steady, rooted kind that comes from truth earned and scars worn with pride. Rachel sat on the porch one evening, the sky glowing orange, a worn envelope in her lap. It was Aaron's last letter, edges soft from reading. She unfolded it slowly and read. His words again: "You don't need a rifle to defend your country. Sometimes you just need a reason." Thunder grazed nearby, calm and strong. He'd become more than a symbol. He was proof that something broken could return, that something taken could be reclaimed. George joined her, a mug in hand, his voice low. "He'd be proud, you know." Rachel nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek. "So would Mom," she said. They sat in silence, listening to the wind through the grass, the creak of the fence, the steady sound of Thunder's hooves. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like nothing was missing, because everything that mattered, they had kept it alive, and that was legacy.